Near the end of his life, a man once known as the architect of Blitzkrieg sat down to write his final words. His name was Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most brilliant military minds. A man whose ideas changed how wars were fought forever. But as the world he helped create crumbled around him, Guderian began his last memoir with a haunting line: "I cannot stay silent anymore." Those words opened his book, Panzer Leader. Published in 1952, just 2 years before his death. It was more than a record of war tactics. It was a confession, an explanation, and perhaps a plea for understanding. Through his writing, Guderian tried to make sense of his own life, his genius, his loyalty, and his guilt. He forced readers to look closely at the thin line between duty and morality, between brilliance and obedience. His story asked a question that has haunted history ever since: what happens when intelligence serves destruction? Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was born in 1888 in Chelm, then part of the German Empire. He came from a proud military family that believed in discipline, loyalty, and service. His father was an army officer, and from an early age, Heinz was trained to think like one. He learned strategy before most boys learn games, and he grew up understanding that orders were to be obeyed without question. But unlike many officers of his generation, Guderian had a restless mind. He questioned old methods and wanted to understand why wars were fought the way they were. When he joined the army, it was clear he was more than just another soldier. He had a sharp, analytical mind and a gift for organization. By the end of World War I, Guderian had become an expert in communication and logistics, the art of moving men and machines efficiently. He saw the horror of trench warfare and how millions of lives were wasted for a few yards of muddy ground. That experience shaped him deeply. He believed there had to be a better way to fight, one that relied on speed and intelligence instead of blood and attrition. After Germany's defeat, the Treaty of Versailles left its army crippled. Tanks, planes, and heavy weapons were banned. Many German officers felt humiliated and hopeless. But Guderian saw opportunity in limitation. If the old ways were gone, new ways could be built. During the quiet years that followed, he began to imagine a different kind of warfare, one that depended on movement, coordination, and surprise rather than numbers and fortifications. He read every book he could find on modern combat, especially the writings of British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Little Hart. They wrote about tanks and mechanized armies, but Guderian didn't just copy them. He built on their ideas and shaped them into something more daring. He imagined entire armies built around armored vehicles, tanks that didn't just support infantry but led the attack themselves. He dreamed of fast, coordinated strikes where tanks, airplanes, and motorized troops moved as one, striking before the enemy could react. It was a vision that would soon shock the world. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was born from Guderian's imagination. It was warfare built on speed, surprise, and precision. When the Second World War began, Guderian's theories moved from paper to reality. His armored divisions tore through Poland in 1939 and stormed across France in 1940. The world had never seen anything like it. Entire nations fell in weeks. Armies that expected to resist for months were crushed almost overnight. For a time, Heinz Guderian became a legend. To the world, he was a military genius. Even his enemies studied his tactics. But in Nazi Germany, genius came with a dangerous price. His success made him valuable to Hitler's plans, but it also made him vulnerable to the politics and ideology surrounding him. Guderian was not a member of the Nazi Party, nor was he driven by its beliefs. He saw himself as a professional soldier, loyal to his country, but not to any ideology. Yet he was bound by oath to obey Hitler, and that oath would soon test the limits of his conscience. At first, he respected Hitler's confidence and determination. But as the war continued, he saw a man driven more by ego than logic. Orders came down that made no sense. Battles were fought for pride instead of strategy, and dissent was punished harshly. Guderian often disagreed with these decisions, but speaking against them could mean death. He was trapped loyal to his duty, but troubled by the path that led him down. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Guderian commanded one of the leading armored groups. At first, his Blitzkrieg strategy worked brilliantly. German forces advanced rapidly into Soviet territory. But as they moved deeper, the vast distances and brutal Russian winter began to grind them down. Tanks froze, fuel ran out, and men died by the thousands. Guderian urged Hitler to focus on capturing Moscow, believing it would bring the Soviets to their knees. But Hitler refused, choosing instead to chase resources and prestige targets. It was a fatal mistake. By the time German forces reached Moscow, the bitter cold and fierce resistance had stopped them completely. The offensive collapsed, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. Furious at Guderian's criticism, Hitler dismissed him from command in December 1941. That moment marked a turning point in Guderian's life. He had built his career on precision, logic, and control, but now he was watching chaos unfold. He believed he had been right, but being right no longer mattered. The war machine he helped design was spinning out of control. He returned to service in 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops. But by then, Germany was already losing. Factories were destroyed, supplies were running out, and the once unstoppable Blitzkrieg had turned into desperate defense. As the war dragged on, Guderian's frustration with Hitler grew. The Führer refused to listen to advice, making impulsive decisions that cost countless lives. Guderian tried to reason with him, sometimes shouting in open meetings, but nothing changed. He was caught between obedience and defiance, trapped in a system that no longer made sense. When the war finally ended in 1945, Guderian was captured by the Allies. They questioned him not just about his tactics, but about his role in the Nazi war effort. He insisted he had only been a soldier, not a politician, and that he had tried to stay out of politics. Still, the moral questions lingered. Could anyone who served that regime truly be innocent? In 1948, Guderian was released from captivity. The world he returned to was not the one he had left. His name was now tied to destruction. The same tactics that had once made him famous had also brought ruin to Europe. Yet, despite the criticism, Guderian felt he had to speak. He believed history would misunderstand him if he stayed silent. In 1952, he published Panzer Leader, his final attempt to explain himself. The book was part defense, part confession. He described the battles he fought, the strategies he created, and the mistakes he witnessed. He wrote with precision, as if recounting a series of experiments rather than a war that had destroyed millions of lives. His tone was calm, almost detached, yet beneath the surface there was a quiet sadness. He wanted to show himself as a professional soldier who had done his duty, while trying to distance himself from the crimes of the Nazi regime. Some saw the book as an effort to protect his reputation. Others believed it was a sincere reflection of a man haunted by his past. Perhaps it was both in his writing. Guderian often repeated one of his favorite sayings: "There are no desperate situations, only desperate people." It revealed his belief in control and disciplined the qualities that had guided his life. But it also showed the limits of his thinking. To him, emotion and morality had no place in strategy. He saw war as a problem to be solved, not a tragedy to be prevented. By focusing on efficiency, he had ignored the human cost. And in his later years, that realization weighed heavily on him. The war had proven his theories right, but at a terrible price. He had built a weapon that made destruction faster and more efficient. And he had lived long enough to see what that meant. When Panzer Leader was released, it sparked debate around the world. Military historians praised his brilliance, while moral critics accused him of hiding behind logic. But everyone agreed that his words gave a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who had seen both sides of power rits, creation and its collapse. In his final years, Guderian lived quietly, far from politics and the army he once served. He spent his days writing, reflecting, and trying to understand the choices he had made. He never completely condemned the war, but he no longer glorified it either. The pride of his early years had faded into a kind of weary honesty. Heinz Guderian died in 1954, at the age of 65. He left behind more than just theories and memoirs. He left behind a question that still echoes through history. What happens when a man values obedience over conscience? His story is both inspiring and tragic. He was a man of immense intellect and innovation, but also one trapped by loyalty to a cause he did not fully believe in. His life reminds us that genius, when guided only by duty and ambition, can become dangerous. In the end, his final words, "I cannot stay silent anymore," were not just the start of a book. They were the echo of a lifetime of obedience, finally breaking into truth. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a witness to what his brilliance had unleashed. He had once believed that war could be perfected, that precision and speed could bring control to chaos. But as his life drew to a close, he seemed to understand the truth, that no matter how fast a tank moves or how perfect a plan seems, nothing can outrun the weight of responsibility. Guderian's legacy lives on, not only in military history, but as a warning of what happens when intellect is used without conscience. His ideas changed the world, but they also burned it. And in the quiet of his final days, as he wrote those simple, haunting words, the world finally heard not the proud voice of a general, but the sorrow of a man who could no longer remain silent. He had avoided being convicted as a war criminal because there was not enough evidence against him. Still, many believed that his book, Panzer Leader, was his way of stepping away from the horrors his army had supported without ever truly taking responsibility for them. On the surface, the book is about tanks, battles, and strategies. But underneath all the maps and operations lies something deeper, a quiet inner struggle. Guderian wrestled with ideas of obedience, duty, and conscience. He tried to present himself as the perfect professional soldier, one who cared only about movement, precision, and discipline. He wanted to be seen as a man focused on machines and men, not politics or ideology. Yet what stands out more than what he wrote is what he chose not to say. He described the hardships of his soldiers, the bitter cold, the sleepless nights, the exhaustion of endless marches. But he said almost nothing about the civilians trapped in the chaos, nor about the atrocities that happened near his command. His silence spoke louder than words. It showed either a refusal to acknowledge the moral cost of his actions, or a deep discomfort that he could never bring himself to express. Historians have long noticed these gaps. They often say that the power of Panzer Leader lies not in the story it tells, but in the story it avoids. Guderian carefully separated himself from politics, always insisting that he was just a soldier following orders. He believed that moral responsibility belonged to political leaders, not the military. This belief, the idea of a clean German army, untouched by Nazi crimes, became one of the most controversial parts of his legacy. After the Nuremberg trials, people found it difficult to believe that any soldier could remain purely professional in such a system. Many saw his devotion to discipline and duty as a kind of denial, a refusal to face the truth of what the war had done. Others sensed something more complicated, a man who believed in order and hierarchy, but who realized too late the terrible cost of blind obedience as the book moves toward its later chapters. Guderian's tone begins to change. His criticism of Hitler becomes sharper, But his anger is never moral. It's always tactical. He doesn't call Hitler evil. He calls him reckless, impatient, and strategically incompetent. His complaints are about wasted tanks and failed offensives, not about genocide or ideology. To him, Hitler's failure was a failure of leadership, not a failure of humanity. This way of thinking might have protected Guderian during the war. It allowed him to survive politically when others were punished or discarded. But after the war, it trapped him. He could only defend himself within the narrow limits of being a soldier, one who obeyed orders, never admitting what he might have known or ignored, by focusing so tightly on duty and discipline. Guderian built a kind of shield around himself. That shield kept him safe, but it also kept him silent. When you read Panzer Leader, it sometimes feels as if you're listening to a man arguing with himself, reasoning, defending, and convincing himself that he had done only what any good officer would do. His words sit uneasily between understanding and excuse, between explanation and denial. And in that space, his story becomes haunting. That uneasy tone is what makes historians question his honesty and what makes readers feel unsettled. Panzer Leader is not a confession. It's the voice of a man exhausted by what he cannot undo, clinging to professionalism because it's all he has left to define himself. When Panzer Leader was first published in 1950, then later translated into English in 1952, it fascinated readers everywhere. Military experts called it a treasure chest of insights into the German war machine. Historians, however, saw something more complex, a book filled with contradictions. On one hand, it gave detailed descriptions of battles, command decisions, and the inner workings of the German army. On the other, it seemed to reshape the past carefully, painting Guderian in a more favorable light. Scholars began comparing his version of events with other records, official reports, diaries, and the memoirs of fellow officers. Soon, cracks started to appear. Some timelines didn't match. Certain meetings were described differently. Responsibility for failed operations often shifted conveniently away from Guderian and onto someone else. Historians noticed how he simplified complex operations to make his own role look stronger. He erased the voices of other commanders, making his decisions seem central and his judgment flawless. Perhaps he thought simplicity would make his story easier to believe. But to historians, it showed selective honesty. He was choosing what to reveal and what to hide. In his book, Guderian often portrayed himself as a brilliant strategist surrounded by fools. Whenever things went wrong, it was never his fault. It was always someone else's interference, usually Hitler's. That framing made Panzer Leader feel less like a genuine memoir and more like a carefully constructed defense, written to protect his reputation. Yet beneath his controlled tone, you can still sense moments of real exhaustion. There are times when his precise mechanical language can't hide the weariness of defeat. But the most striking absence remains his near-complete silence about the war's moral side. There is no mention of the suffering of millions, no acknowledgement of the crimes committed by the Wehrmacht, and no reflection on the moral collapse of the system he served. Instead, his pages are filled with plans, logistics, and strategies, as if war were nothing more than a massive technical puzzle. It's this detachment that made Panzer Leader both respected and controversial. The book became an essential manual for military thinkers, yet also a reminder of how easily history can be told without conscience. Still, Panzer Leader was never dismissed. Its power lies not only in what it tells us about the war, but in what it shows about the man who wrote it, a man struggling to shape how he would be remembered. The errors, omissions, and self-justifications don't erase its importance. They make it human. They show a man caught between pride and guilt, trying to make sense of a past too heavy to bear. Over time, Panzer Leader became required reading in military academies around the world. Its lessons on mobility, coordination, and mechanized warfare influenced generations of officers. Yet historians agreed on one thing: it isn't a reliable record of facts. Instead, it's a window into a man's mind, a man trying to rewrite his own story. Before others could write it for him, Guderian wasn't just describing battles. He was building an image of himself as a thinker, not a follower. As a strategist, not a soldier complicit in destruction, by the time he finished writing Panzer Leader. Guderian was old and tired. The energy that had once driven him across Europe was fading. His memoir reads like the final act of a man who knows his time is nearly over. For years after completing it, he died, leaving behind a book that would outlive him and continue to stir debate. Beneath his calm, structured words, you can sense the weariness of someone who has seen too much. In the final chapters, his once confident tone begins to tremble. The sharpness of his analysis softens into fatigue. He admits that he cannot sleep at night, haunted by memories of soldiers freezing, starving, and suffering. These are not the words of a victorious general. They are the cries of a man haunted by his own memories. He writes that he could no longer remain silent, that everything was collapsing around him, and no one would listen. His writing shifts from authority to despair. It feels as if he realized, far too late, that all his tactical brilliance could not save a nation drowning in its own madness. Historians see these final pages as the closest Guderian ever came to facing the truth. He never openly confessed guilt, but his tone carries the weight of recognition. He may not have said the words, but the regret seeps through his sentences. Whether he failed to see the evil of Hitler's vision or chose to ignore it, the result was the same. He obeyed. That obedience built his fame but destroyed his peace. In those last reflections, there is no pride left. The man who once dreamed of unstoppable movement is now describing nothing but collapse and confusion. His famous belief in acting decisively feels hollow, almost tragic. The unstoppable general had become an old man watching the ruins of his own legacy. When he died in 1954, Panzer Leader had already made him famous worldwide. It stood as both a technical masterpiece and a personal tragedy, a guide to warfare and a mirror, reflecting the emptiness left by war itself. His last words in the book carry no anger, only exhaustion. "I cannot stay silent anymore," he wrote, as if finally letting go of the weight he had carried for years. He had tried to create order out of chaos. But in the end, even his disciplined mind could not control the truth. The war had been lost long before the last battle ended. What remained was pride, regret, and the silent shadow of guilt. And that is what makes Panzer Leader so haunting. It isn't just about tanks or tactics or history. It's about a man standing in the ruins of everything he built, trying to convince himself and the world that he had done the right thing. In the end, Guderian's story reminds us of a painful truth that even the most intelligent, disciplined people can become trapped in the very systems they create. His brilliance reshaped modern warfare, but his silence left behind questions that still echo today. Was he a visionary trying to survive within a corrupt regime? Or a loyal soldier who refused to question enough? Was he a hero of strategy or a man too afraid to face his guilt? Perhaps he was both. His life forces us to confront the uneasy space between genius and responsibility, between duty and morality, between following orders and knowing when to refuse them. Guderian left behind no clear answers, only the haunting voice of a man caught between obedience and remorse. And maybe that, more than anything else, is why his final words still echo through history.